you, Vincent, for the introduction. I'm very, very happy to give the talk in your series. I think it's a very, very cool thing that you do, really promoting the science and the research done by postdocs and PhD students. So appreciate it very much. Thank you. Today, I thought to talk about the research that I've done during my PhD studies, and it was mostly focused on analyzing the JV curve. And I'm a real fan of very simple techniques, but then I believe when they're analyzed more deeply, we can get still some insights about underlying physics in organic solar cells. So that's something I want to share with you, and I hope you will find it interesting. So first of all, I was asked to do a motivational slide for people studying perovskites here. So I want to convince you that organic solar cells are at least as cool as perovskites. So you probably know that they are cheap, easy to process. So we hope that they will complement really the silicon solar cells by their possibility to be used in building integration, also agrivoltaics. Due to their high absorption coefficients, they can be very thin and light. So again, we can put them on roofs, for example, which cannot take much load. And recently, power conversion efficiencies have surpassed 20%. So yes, the future is really bright for organic solar cells. The solar cell itself consists of donor and acceptor, so at least two materials, at least classically, sandwiched between transport layers and electrodes. And to analyze or assess the performance, we usually measure the JV curve to extract open circuit voltage, short circuit current, and the fill factor, which all in all determine the power conversion efficiency. So my research was really focusing on the fill factor because I find that it's most hard to interpret. Therefore, it's the most interesting one to study. And really just to understand the JV curve, we were using JV curves at different light intensities and analyzing them mostly at VOC. So this will be the focus of my talk. First of all, let's look how different processes, so process from exciton generation to charge extraction, how these processes affect the JV curve, and how do we get this experimental JV curve that we measure in the lab. So first of all, first photogeneration step is the absorption of photon of specific energy higher than the effective bandgap. Once the photon is absorbed, the electron is promoted to higher energy, and we have the tightly bound exciton. So organic semiconductors are excitonic materials, and we need many steps before we can get free charge carriers. So in order to be split, this exciton must travel to the interface between two materials, donor and acceptor, where electron is then transferred to acceptor. And in case that the exciton actually doesn't reach the interface, these excitons get lost. So this is exciton recombination, and it doesn't depend on the voltage. Eventually, electron-hole pairs get separated, but in case if their binding energy, for example, is high, this can lead to voltage-dependent GEMS recombination. So we get a slight slope here on the JV curve usually. Once electron-hole separate, they can again meet at the interface, which leads to a further change in the curvature of the JV curve. And the last loss mechanism is charge transfer. So while electron and hole are moving to the electrodes, really the slow movement of these charge carriers can be taken as internal series resistance. And this leads to additional voltage loss between these two curves. So this mechanism we found is very important, called transport resistance. Now, from the point of view of free charge carriers, so JV curve, of course, relates to free charge carriers. We can separate all the steps into three different parts. So first is photogeneration, recombination, and charge carrier transport. So in this talk, I will focus on two of them, the ones that influence the JV curve the most. These are recombination and charge transport. So starting from recombination, I will introduce the work which uses the diode ideality factor, or recombination ideality factor as we call it, to finally find what is the density of state of organic semiconductors. So this is the method. The data that you need for this is really the light intensity dependent JV curves. And for this analysis, we only need VOC values. And also light intensity. It's important to actually, if you want to do something like that, it's important to measure your light intensity exactly, not only trust the filter values. So it would be nice to have, if you're planning to build Sans VOC setup, then you probably should measure light intensity via photodiode or something like that. So what concerns the analysis, at open circuit conditions, we know that generation, which is contained in this recombination term, can be extracted from the slope of the Sans VOC data here. And now the meaning of the ideality factor is really different if you look at crystalline semiconductors compared to organic semiconductors. So for the crystalline ones, you expect usually that ideality factor of 1 means direct recombination, while something closer to 2 indicates that you have more and more Shockley Rithold trap-assisted recombination. So this is also something very often used in organic solar cell papers, but I think there is a bit of misconception here. So it is actually important to understand that in disordered semiconductors like organic ones, ideality factor depends strongly on the density of states. So the values between 1 and 2 will not mean the same thing as for crystalline semiconductors. So as a background, for example, if we take exponential density of states, by exponential I mean that both holes and electrons are described by exponential. Here I will be describing the recombination channel where we have a mobile hole recombining with trapped electrons. As we know in organic semiconductors, recombination is mostly trap-assisted, so this is the dominant channel that I will be describing. And here the ideality factor is really connected to recombination rate. And if we do our math, we will see that ideality factor depends on the characteristic energy of the Urbach energy, and this is really just the slope of the density of states. So if you would like to analyze your ideality factors and plot it versus temperature, then exponential density of states would lead to temperature-dependent ideality factor, but this temperature dependence really just very slight, so we have a slight increase for decrease in temperature. Now, another density of states which is commonly employed for organics is Gaussian. So here both electrons and holes are described by the Gaussian distribution. And here, even though the recombination is trap-assisted, fully trap-assisted, the ideality factor is unity and it is independent of temperature. So you see direct contradiction to crystalline semiconductor that even ideality factor of 1 does not mean this is recombination between mobile charge carriers in organic semiconductors. So what is usually not considered is the mixed density of states. I saw that the first mention of this density of states was in this paper by Andres and Dita. Very good paper, very recommended. So here we have two possibilities, right? Still, we are describing the recombination channel between holes and trapped electrons. And if mobile holes come from the exponential density of states, but trapped electrons from the Gaussian, then the ideality factor is the same like we had for the purely Gaussian density of states. So it's unity independent of temperature. But now if we reverse the distributions and mobile holes will come from the Gaussian density of states, electrons will be trapped in the exponential, then ideality factor becomes temperature dependent. But this temperature dependence is different than for what we saw for the purely exponential density of states. So we can use this model actually to distinguish what kind of temperature dependence we have for the ideality factor, and by that make the conclusion about our density of states. So it is important to note here that whenever the mobile charge carriers come from the Gaussian, we have ideality factor which is unity and independent of temperature. Yeah, sorry, it was different. So whenever trapped charge carriers are described by the Gaussian, then we have ideality factor of unity, and whenever trapped charge carriers are described by the exponential density of states, ideality factor becomes temperature dependent. Right, so we decided to test this model first before applying it to organics. And our reference was amorphous silicon. It's a well-studied system. And from previous publications, we expect exponential density of states. So what we did, we measured many light intensity JV curves and extracted VOC data from 300 down to 150 Kelvin as a function of light intensity. And here we can fit at each temperature the data with a single slope over 2 orders of magnitude. So as I mentioned, we are expecting exponential density of states. And when we plot our ideality factors versus temperature, indeed, it follows exponential density of states pretty nicely. If we fit the data according to this equation, we are able to extract the characteristic energy of 78 millielectron volts. So I have to note here that this characteristic energy is independent of temperature. So the slope of this distribution is a single number. So you can see here that for a mixed density of states, the behavior of the ideality factor would be completely different. So we are actually able to distinguish between these two models if we measure down to low temperatures. So having confirmed the model, we now switch to organic donor acceptor systems. This was a bit random choice, but we decided to choose something with fullerene, so P3HT PCBM, non-fullerene acceptor PM6Y6, and then also took a thermally evaporated solar cell that was kindly provided by Heliatech. And here is the data of the solar cells from 100 to 300 Kelvin. And yeah, here probably better to see. Here we cannot feed the data over all orders of magnitude with a single slope because we have a slight curvature on the semi-logarithmic axis. So this means that we need to take local derivatives. So we take the ideality factor not from the slope, but from the derivative at each point here. So first, let's take the evaporated solar cell as an example. And first, we analyze the temperature at a given light intensity. So these dashed lines represent the slices of the data. And here I have the ideality factor plotted versus temperature and 2 models as a guideline. So you probably can see that we can't Can't have any conclusions about the data because it's all over the place. But probably we can get some hints where to look for next. So first of all, we see that the ideality factor is indeed temperature dependent, which tells us already that the trapped charge carrier doesn't come from the Gaussian density of states. But then another thing is something unexpected for the exponential, is that the ideality factor depends on the light intensity. So these different colors represent light intensities. For the purely exponential density of states with a single slope, we would expect that it doesn't depend on the light intensity, so we would have 1 point for each temperature. So this tells us that probably the density of states deviates from the exponential, and if it deviates from the exponential, the characteristic energy will depend on how deep we are in the density of states. So having that in mind, we switched our analysis to analyzing the ideality factor at a specific open circuit voltage. So the results are plotted here. The same data, ideality factor versus inverse temperature. And you can see that now we are actually able to describe the data with, in this case, mixed density of states model. But this is only for specific open circuit voltage. So all of this data is plotted at specific open circuit voltage. So our explanation is that we are probing the density of states with open circuit voltage. And as we are going deeper into the effective band gap, the Urbach energy or characteristic energy is increasing. So the characteristic energy as such becomes a strong function of the open circuit voltage. Here we have Urbach energy plotted for different open circuit voltages, but at a specific point in the density of states, it is actually independent of temperature. What does it mean for our density of states model is that this evaporated solar cell is described, first of all, by the mixed density of states, where one charge carrier is trapped in the so-called exponential density of states, and mobile comes from the Gaussian density of states. But the exponential density of states is only approximating what is going on in the real dose at specific energy level. So that's why we have increasing characteristic energy as we come deeper into the band gap. Now, when we analyzed the data for P3HD PCBM and PM6Y6, we saw the same trend. For P3HD PCBM, we found that the data was best described by the purely exponential density of states. Again, exponential describes the density of states only locally at specific energy. And PM6Y6 was then again described by the mixed density of states, the same as we saw for evaporated solar cell. Now, by using specific equations for exponential and mixed dose, they are different, we are able to extract the Urbach energy from this ideality factor data. And when we plot it versus open circuit voltage, so open circuit voltage here represents lower open circuit voltage, means that we are deeper in the band gap. So we see that Urbach energy actually for all the systems in these highlighted areas is increasing towards the center of the band gap linearly. And what we also saw and was really exciting for us, that all the data actually converges for all the temperatures from 100 to 300 Kelvin. So this linearity actually led to the shape of the density of states, at least. We still do not know what is exactly the density of states, but we know that the shape follows the power law. So compared to the exponential density of states, in the power law, the characteristic energy is not constant, and then you will have lower characteristic energy closer to approaching the effective band gap, and then it becomes more and more steep towards the center. I think if you have any questions regarding this part, it's a good time to ask, because I will be switching to transport now.
I'm not sure this will be practical. I think it's better we keep the
All right.
for audience.
Very good. Very good.
But there will be some.
All right, so the next part, recombination is covered now, and next part is then transport resistance, something I have worked on a lot during the last 2 years, I would say. So what is transport resistance? It's really the loss which is coming from the slow movement of charge carriers. You can take the conductivity and interpret it, if conductivity is low, as internal resistance to the movement of charge carriers. This is really the idea, and how we evaluate it. Essentially, the data is the same as we used for the ideality factor, but analyzed differently. So here we take the Sans VOC curve as a resistance-free curve. If it's resistance-free, it gives us the JV curve, which is not affected by transport resistance. And it's shifted down by the generation current density. So the Sans VOC curve includes recombination losses, but no transport resistance losses. And then we compare the Sans VOC curve to the experimental JV curve. And experimental JV curve, of course, on top of recombination losses, also includes transport resistance. So slow conductivity leads to additional slope of the experimental JV curve. And this difference in slopes of the JV curves leads to the voltage loss that we call voltage loss due to transport resistance. And yes, it's directly related to transport resistance times the current density. And it becomes larger for materials with low conductivity. So if you want to analyze this analytically, then the best way is to take the slopes around open circuit voltage and the Sans VOC curve, which does not contain transport resistance losses, would then depend only on the recombination ideality factor, which enters the diode equation. Whereas for the experimental JV curve, here we have additional increase by the figure of merit alpha. So the slope will be dependent on the sum of the ideality factor and alpha. And alpha was introduced first in the paper by Dieter Neher. Right, so what is alpha? Obviously, in order to understand the JV curve, we need to understand alpha. First of all, on a very general terms, it depends on the competition between recombination and conductivity at open circuit conditions. And the effect of alpha, if you go from 0 to 100, for example, that it stretches the JV curve compared to the open circuit voltage. For the value of 1, you will not have a lot of field factor loss, but if you approach 10 and 100, the field factor losses will be very significant. Now, of course, because recombination and transport are taking place in the same density of states, and we saw that recombination depends on the ideality factor, conductivity will also depend on how charge carriers get trapped and detrapped in the density of states. So for the conductivity, we introduced the ideality factor and sigma, which we call the transport ideality factor. So for us, the question was, do we have the relation between the recombination and conductivity? And can we determine which of the charge carriers contributes to recombination and which of them to conductivity? So really by using the voltage dependence of these two ideality factors, we hope to see the connection. But how to get the conductivity? So this is something that I personally like. If you go through the analytic theory, which is not very hard, you will find that the conductivity can actually be extracted from the difference in the slopes at open circuit voltage. So this is essentially how we extract conductivity. We take the slope of this external voltage, so illuminated JV curve, and subtract the slope of the sans VOC curve, and this gives us the conductivity. So the resulting data for PM6Y6 is plotted versus open circuit voltage for different temperatures from 200 to 300 Kelvin. And as expected, if you increase the open circuit voltage, conductivity increases. So really extracting ideality factor is the same as we did for the recombination ideality factor. We just take the slope of this data and we get n sigma. So let's now compare what analytic theory would give us for recombination and conductivity. So this is now the example of PM6Y6. And there we saw that recombination is described by the mixed density of states, first of all. So one Gaussian, one exponential. We do not know which is electrons and holes, but here we take really a recombination channel of just mobile holes recombining with trapped electrons. Right, and we have this equation for recombination ideality factor. So effective conductivity that we extracted is a combination of the conductivity of electrons and holes. But then if one of them is dominant, we can probably see it from the transport ideality factor. So if the same mobile charge carrier is limiting transport as for recombination, then we have one expression for the transport ideality factor. But if we have the opposite dominance, then the temperature dependence of this ideality factor will be different. And if you relate the two ideality factors, so the recombination to transport, for the same charge carrier, you get always 1/2. But if you have opposite dominance, then this dependence will be different. So essentially it will be ideality factor minus 1/2. So next we applied this model to PM6Y6 data. And what can we see here? So we have ideality factor ratio, and remember it's 1/2 if we have the same dominance of charge carriers. And it follows 1/2, yes, at high illumination intensities. But as we go deeper into the band gap, we clearly see that the dominance is actually switching, so that the conductivity is then dominated by the power law density of states, and recombination dominated by charge carriers from the Gaussian density of states. So because the conductivity which is extracted from the JV curve is usually should be dominated by the slower charge carrier, so the slope becomes more steep for the larger voltage loss. It means that the recombination in PM6Y6 is dominated by faster charge carriers, whereas conductivity is limited by the slower charge carrier, which is coming from the power law density of states. Now, what concerns the fill factor losses, we can, by using this technique, we can actually separate fill factor losses into ones caused by recombination and ones caused by transport resistance. So the Sans VOC curve can be analyzed in the same way as the experimental JV curve, and we can extract the pseudo fill factor. And this fill factor will not contain transport resistance losses. And now we can compare it to the experimental JV curve, to this fill factor, and the difference will give us the information of how much transport resistance losses contribute to the overall fill factor losses. So first of all, in my recent publication, we did this analysis just for some systems that we measured Sans VOC on in our lab. And here you have fill factor plotted versus VOC. So from, you probably know the green equation. So from green equation, it is known that for higher VOC, the fill factor upper limit will be higher. And the full circles here represent the pseudo fill factors, so the ones which contain only recombination losses, and open circles are real fill factors of the experimental JV curve. So the difference between this upper limit and the full circle represents recombination loss, and then the difference between the two circles is the transport resistance loss. So maybe except for P3HD PCBM, where recombination losses were very high, for other cells, we really see that transport resistance is the dominant loss of the fill factor. And recently, we wrote a perspective with also amazing collaborators on the same topic. Got accepted today. Congratulations, Chen, if you are listening. So there we actually took the data from the literature, and the data was just the open circuit voltage and the ideality factor. And by using the green equation, we were able to estimate what would be the pseudo fill factor of the solar cell. And here we had some selection of 90% or approximately 90% state-of-the-art solar cells. And you can see that the same thing, the recombination losses are really minimal because, well, ideality factor are close to 1 now, and these have been minimized. So the transport resistance is really dominant fill factor loss also in this state-of-the-art solar cells. So this is the conclusion of my talk. I hope I could convince you that analyzing the JV curves can be fun, also apart from just determining the power conversion efficiency. So just by using this data, we were actually able to show the form of the density of states in organic solar cells. And I hope to have really more and more research on this topic. It's really exciting. I showed you also how to quantify transport resistance losses and how to extract conductivity from the JV data. And finally, by using this data, we could show that transport resistance losses dominate fill factor losses. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and thank really the whole OPCAM group and our amazing collaborators and funding, of course. So I will be happy to answer hopefully all of your questions during the discussion. Thank you.